Welcome to the International College of Dentists project, the Outstanding Leaders of Dentistry. Today we are delighted and honored to have with us the Director of the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research at the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Lawrence Tabak. Larry, thank you. I know how busy things are in the government these days, but I sure appreciate you coming out here to sit and talk with us a couple minutes of who you are and what's going on at the NIDCR these days.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure.
As you know, these tapes are put out to the public and to the profession of dentistry, and also are kept at the National Museum of Dentistry in Baltimore. Now, let's get started, because I know there's a lot of things we need to talk about. Let's start in Brooklyn. Brooklyn was where you're born. Tell me about those days. Tell me about Mom and Dad. Tell me about your brothers and sisters.
Well, not a whole lot to tell. There was no dad. I was raised in a single-parent household. My grandmother lived with us. We lived in an apartment house, Kings Highway and 95th Street. And the interesting thing about those days was that, looking back, we lived very modestly. But of course, everybody around us lived exactly the same way, so nobody realized we were living modestly. We just thought this is the way it was. Brooklyn was, a very vital place, teeming with people from all over the world, even back then. And so we had an opportunity, really, to learn to get along with all sorts of folks from all backgrounds. And really, of course, the educational system, the public educational system there, was quite superior. And so the first person who had an impact on my development, as it were, was Mr. Berman, who was the chairman of the biology department at Tilden High School. And Mr. Berman had this view that even high school kids could do science. And because I needed to work on a part-time basis, Mr. Berman arranged for me to do the lab prep for all the classes. And so I was in those days, you would actually do a dissection of a frog.
Yes, I recall that.
And I was the person who prepped all the frogs for all the classes. And so I would start 6:30 or so in the morning, pithing frogs, which was what you needed to do, and hundreds of them, because the classes were very large. But as a result of that interaction with Mr. Berman, I began to develop the idea that science was something that was attainable for someone like myself. So that was actually a very important part and start to my scientific career.
So your mom raised you. Did you have brothers and sisters?
I have a younger sister and a younger brother. I was sort of a combination big brother, pseudo-dad to them, as you might imagine. But again, it seemed like everybody was in the same boat, so you never really thought, oh my goodness, we're living modestly. It was just the way it was.
So high school was a pretty good time for you.
I would say so. We were on split session, which meant that we started class about 7:30 in the morning. We were done by about 1. That allowed me to work in Waldbaum's, which is a supermarket chain. I don't even know if they're still in existence. And I was the dairy boy. I was the person who cut the lox and sable and all these other kinds of fishes behind the counter and unpacked the milk and cream and so forth. And so I worked after school every day, and it was very convenient. No, those were fine times, of course.
Who directed you on to advanced education then? Who was the...
Well, there was no history of anybody having advanced education in my family. I believe my father went through 5th grade, although I didn't have very much to do with him. My mom graduated with a commercial diploma from high school, which was very common in those days for women. And so basically, it was my mother who said, you have to go to college. Of course, it has to be a college you can afford to go to. And fortunately for me, in those days, the City University was free. as long as you had a certain, grade and so forth. And so I was very lucky and fortunate to grow up in New York City at that time because I was able to get a free college education. And the city college, as I'm sure you know, really was the home to just so many exceptional teachers, particularly in the sciences. And so again, I had the great fortune of meeting people who were able to put my career development a little bit ahead of their needs and wants. So Ralph Zuzolo was a biology professor who put me on as a lab technician. In the first few years, I took a lot of courses in the afternoon and the evenings and worked during the day. And then in the last few years, I flip-flopped because you needed to take laboratories, and those were only given during the day. But Ralph allowed me to work at night. And together with his then friend, now spouse, Betty Fong, they really provided an environment which, again, both paid me, a salary, which helped, and also gave me the opportunity to explore science. So it really is a spectacular.
You've been in science your whole life.
Very much so. Certainly since ninth grade in high school. That's right.
So now, where did dentistry start to phase into your? I know you were going on from to Columbia.
Well, dentistry came about as an accident, total serendipity. I had finished up college, still not entirely sure what I wanted to do, enrolled in a master's program at Hunter College. The price was right, it was free, and in fact they paid you to go to graduate school, which I thought was a wonderful thing. And I got involved in a research project with a fellow named Walter Birch, a very famous biophysicist. And the title of the project was Delayed Light Emission from Digitonin-Prepared Subchloroplast Particles.
Oh, I got that one.
Now, I remember that very distinctly because it was very important for me to go into dentistry, so I'll explain why. I realized about halfway through the first year of this curriculum that there were only 3 people in the world who cared about this project that I was doing. My mentor, myself, for vested reasons, and then this crazy person in England. And that was it. No one else cared. And so at that point I realized that whilst I really wanted to do research very badly, it needed to be research that was more meaningful. And around that time, several people, actually my peer group, friends who were enrolled as I was, began to say to me, gee, if you're really interested in helping people and we want to combine that with research, why don't you think about dentistry? And about the time, I had an opportunity to meet a dentist who had been at Columbia University. He actually was the husband of a woman who was a client of my father-in-law. So my father-in-law is a hairdresser. So it was through my father-in-law, the hairdresser, and his client, who I met this gentleman, and he really explained to me what some of the possibilities were in dentistry, which up until that moment I had never even considered. And almost on a lark, I hate to say that, but almost on a lark, I applied to dental school. I actually applied quite late. Was accepted to Columbia University. Probably somebody dropped out at the last minute and they needed to fill a class because my acceptance came in May, I think, late May, early June. But my good luck was there, and so enrolled at Columbia.
Were those good days? Did you enjoy dental school? Were they happy days?
No, I wouldn't call them happy days. In fact, I would say it was probably the most traumatic 4 years of my life. And if not for Dan Fine and Erwin Mandel, I never would have gotten through dental school. What had happened was I went into dental school at a time when Columbia was very devoted to turning out the very best clinician possible. And I went into dental school, unlike all the other people in my class, knowing that what I wanted to do was research. And I wasn't very bashful about telling folks that. And so the first 2 years of dental school were fine, because at Columbia, as I think you know, you basically take the medical school curriculum.
Yes.
The dental students and the medical students are side by side and everything. And the first 2 years were fine. In fact, I was exempted from several of the basic science courses because of my graduate work at Hunter, and wound up TAing some of the classes, and that was good because it allowed me to earn some money, because for the first time in my life I had tuition to pay. I had never known tuition before. This was a new experience for me. And but then, of course, in the summer between the second and third year, we started something called dental anatomy. And I'll never forget the gentleman's name, Dr. Leiter, Gary Leiter. And he gave everybody in the class a lower incisor that had been shaved in half. I guess they used a Joe Dandy disc or something. And they said, "Okay, everybody, restore this and with wax." And the smart aleck that I was, the first question I said is, "Why would I want to do that?" And that was sort of the beginning of the end of my clinical experience there. And I became a marked person immediately, because most of the faculty truly didn't understand what I was doing in dental school. Most of the faculty in those days were practitioners from the community who volunteered their time, and they truly were volunteers. They're sort of unsung heroes of dental education. And they couldn't understand why they were wasting their time with this crazy guy who didn't want to really do dentistry. He didn't want to be a real dentist. He wanted to be locked up in a lab someplace. And so Danny Fine, who was one of my professors at the time, and of course Irwin Mandel, really took me under their wings, protected me. They truly did protect me. When I finally graduated, Irwin smiled and said he had so much extra time on his hands. And I said, "Why do you have so much time?" He said, "Well, I spent an hour every day talking you out of leaving dental school, and an hour every day talking somebody else out of throwing you out of dental school." And so, no, I would say those 4 years were the most traumatic, stormy time of my life.
Okay, then let's continue the sequence of what your progress through the career of research was. You headed north a little bit.
So for trucking off to Buffalo. So that was sort of an interesting situation. Whilst a dental student, although I wasn't a particularly good clinician student, I did accomplish a fair amount in research, and had published a number of papers and so forth. And so I applied to the 2 training grants that existed at the time for people who were interested in salivary biology, one at Washington in Seattle and the other in Buffalo in New York. And it was interesting. I was accepted to both programs, and both letters basically said the same thing. They said, "We've accepted you, but remember, if you come here, you need to maintain a B average in order to maintain your matriculation." Because as you can imagine, my grade point average in dental school wasn't the highest possible. But the difference was the Buffalo letter had an individual handwritten note on it which says, "Larry, we know you'll do well." And the letter from Seattle had no such handwritten note. And so I decided at that moment that it was Buffalo that I had to go to, because they seemed to have a little more confidence in my ability to maintain this B average. So I went to Buffalo, and this was perhaps one of the most extraordinary opportunities ever given to anybody. Art Ellison was the chair of the department. He had just stepped down, and Bob Jenko assumed the chair. I worked with a fellow named Mike Levine, who was an extraordinary scientist, actually trained in Buffalo, went to Harvard for perio training, and did a postdoctoral fellowship with a fellow named Robert Spiro, who was one of the true giants in glycobiology. And Michael was very, very rigorous in how he approached science. And we had it was a moment in time where the Buffalo program just had such an extraordinary group of students. So my classmates, Tom Van Dyke, Joe Zambon, Mark Hertzberg, Mark Patters, Harvey Shankine, Patricia Murray. Could you think how wonderful the journal clubs must have been?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was just an extraordinary time. And so we learned from each other, and we pushed each other in the best of ways. And so it was, in contrast to dental school where things were a little stormy, in graduate school, I just couldn't believe my good fortune. Here, I'm allowed to do research, and they're paying me to do it. It was astonishing. I couldn't believe how lucky I was, and had just a spectacular time there. Now, about 1 year into the program, I went to Bob and asked for permission to join the perio program, because in those days, most oral biology scientists were periodontists. That was the combination that was most in vogue. Now, when I originally applied to the program, I was rejected from the perio program because they felt my clinical background wasn't sufficiently
Came back
strong.
to haunt you, didn't it?
Well, it was quite fascinating, actually. So the point of the story is I hold the distinction of being the only PhD student who graduated from Buffalo who was rejected not once from the perio program, but twice. Oh. So something that I remind Bob Jenko every moment I can. So I was actually rejected a second time. Midstream, I had begun to demonstrate that I was modestly successful at what I was doing, and thought, okay, now maybe I've proven myself, and now they'll accept me into this program. But in fact, no, they would not have it. They felt that I just didn't have the clinical background. So here I was, one of the very few who went through the Buffalo program, just earning the PhD alone, and decided to stay on the faculty while I was a graduate student. I was fortunate enough to be awarded my first grant from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And on the basis of that, I actually was a member of the research faculty while I was still a graduate student. It was a course of action that repeated itself actually a few years later in my career. So here I was on the research faculty, just having a wonderful time, when then Mike Levine's wife, Ming Shi, approached me. She, at the time, was the chairman of the Department of Endodontics. And she said, Larry, how would you like a tenure track state line position in the Department of Endodontics? I want to bring research into the Department of Endodontics. And so I wanted to know who I had to kill in order to get this tenure track position. And she said, no, you don't have to kill anybody, but you do have to take endodontic training. And I said, no, wait a minute. Ming, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard, because here I've been rejected by the perio folks not once but twice, and you want to take me into your endodontics program? Do you know what you're getting yourself into? I haven't put a handpiece in my hand for over 5 years now. And no, don't worry, it'll work out. So I agreed to take endodontic training on a part-time basis in lieu of faculty practice, which I wasn't doing anyway. So became a faculty member in the Department of Endodontics, taught the sophomore technique class in endodontics. But I have to say, Ming proved to be an extraordinary teacher. She basically held my hand the first year and a half or so, and basically taught me how to do dentistry, or at least endodontics. As part of dentistry. So much so that she was stunned to learn that I had never used a high-speed handpiece before. She said, well, how could you get through dental school without using a high-speed handpiece? I said, well, at that time, Columbia had just switched over to these high-speed turbines. and the faculty were afraid that I would do irreparable harm to both my patients and myself, I suppose. And so the first time I ever used a high-speed handpiece was during my endodontic residency with Ming Shi, sort of holding my hand. So that's how I got involved in endodontic training.
So from Buffalo then to Rochester, you didn't go far.
Well, we started getting closer back home, which of course was New York City. So we went 65 miles to the east. Bill Bowen, who was the chair of the Department of Dental Research in Rochester, had been trying to recruit me for a number of years. And of course, Bill was very clever about this. He always used soft sell. He would invite me every year to give a lecture about saliva in his graduate course in oral biology in Rochester. And every year he would talk to me and tell me about how great he thought this place would be and how there's just this missing piece and that somehow I could help fill that missing piece and so forth. And I just said, gee, thanks, but I have the greatest job in the world and why would I ever want to leave? But there did come a time when I realized my own limitations. I realized that to be a triple threat, that is a true triple threat, took abilities that I just didn't have. I knew this because I had started by referring any molar surgeries to my colleagues, then any surgeries, then difficult molar cases. And I realized when I started referring incisors that it was probably time to step away from trying to be a clinician, a teacher. And my research had gotten to the point where I felt that if I wanted to do it in a very serious way, I was going to have to devote much more of my energies to it. And so, realizing what my limitations were, I decided that maybe it was time to move to a new environment. And of course, Rochester's the perfect dental school in the world. There are no dental students. Yeah. It's just this unique environment. And so here I was in the middle of a school of medicine. Now, what most people don't know is when I moved to Rochester, I moved from a tenured position in Buffalo to an untenured position in Rochester. Bill assured me that in a short period of time I would get tenure, but that I needed to come on this untenured position because people needed to make sure that I was okay and so forth. And I never told my wife until many, many, many years later, but it did work out. Bill is an extraordinary mentor, not only in terms of science, but in terms of how science is practiced. And it was from Bill that I began to learn about science administration because he was just such an extraordinary scientific administrator. And so really he took me under his wing. I became sort of his junior partner. He was very gracious in explaining decisions as he made them, almost in real time, so I could understand why he went this way and not that way. And it was really just a great one-on-one tutoring that he provided to me.
So you were there until 2000.
Right.
When you became the 7th director at the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. I got it that time.
Yes.
What inclined you to, you had some wonderful predecessors, and we were privileged to have each of them on this same Outstanding Leaders project. What did you feel was important that you put your name in for this particular very, very important and impactful job in dentistry?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned my predecessors. I almost didn't apply because of my predecessors, and not for the reasons that you may think. I have enormous respect for both Hal Slavkin and Harold Lowe, and I just couldn't see myself being them. Particularly Hal, who, as you know, is this extraordinary individual who is able to communicate in ways that very few people are able to.
Yes, yes.
And I just couldn't picture myself being able to do what Hal did. And so I did a lot of soul searching when I was asked to apply for the position. And I spoke with Erwin Mandel, of course, a great deal, and Bill Bowen a great deal, and Bruce Baum, who was at the National Institutes of Health, a friend of many, many years. And they persuaded me that the directors come in all shapes, sizes, and forms, and that being myself, I could still had something to contribute. And so what prompted me to put my name in was their encouragement and really a desire to give back in the best way that I knew how. Mm-hmm. So here's this person from Brooklyn who really has had this extraordinary series of opportunities. And all along the way, multiple people put my career development ahead of their own needs. And all along the way, I was able to support a family and meet amazing people and do wonderful things and exciting things. And so I felt that of all the things that I could potentially do to try and give back, that this was the position where I could accomplish that. I was very skeptical, of course, because I could think of a dozen or so people who would be eminently more qualified than I was. I guess the one part of my background that maybe gave me a little bit of an edge is because I was at a school of medicine and served as the research dean of a medical school. I understood how academic health centers worked. And for whatever reason, that seemed to resonate with the search committee. Also, it didn't hurt that the chair of the search committee was Steve Katz, who was the director of NIAMS, arthritis musculoskeletal. And he's a dermatologist by training. And my dean in Rochester, Lowell Goldsmith, is a dermatologist and a very good friend, frankly. So that didn't hurt either. Yes. And so when the then acting director, Ruth Kirstein, called me in July of 2000 and said, you know, we would like you to take this position, I was absolutely stunned. I immediately said yes. That was a little scary. After I said yes, I realized I hadn't gotten a blessing from my wife. I mean, we had talked about it a great deal. So that was the second time my marriage where I really took a tremendous gamble. But fortunately, Robin, you know, continued to be extraordinarily supportive of all these crazy things that I want to do. And off we went to Bethesda. Okay,
speaking of family, tell me about that wonderful wife that supported you through some interesting times and children.
Well, Robin is sort of the anchor to everything that I do. She was the one who talked me out of jumping out the window when I was in dental school, almost on a daily basis. I've known Robin forever. So I met her when she was 14, started dating her when she was 16, and we've been married 30 plus years now. So I don't ever remember a time when I didn't know Robin. She's an elementary school teacher. She teaches second grade. But really has kept me organized, kept me grounded, and you know, without her, nothing could be accomplished. My two sons, Jonathan, who's the oldest, and Benjamin, the youngest, both great kids. Fortunately, they take their intelligence after their mom, and their good looks after their mom, and you know, are both you know, beginning to make their own independent lives. It's quite fascinating to see that transition, of course, and they too have been very supportive of all the craziness through the years when, you know, I was perhaps not around all the time when I could have been or should have been, but they understood. I'll tell you a funny story. When my younger boy I mean, when he was very young, he'll be 24 actually next week. So, but when he was very young, we were in a rabbi's study. We were talking about his older brother's bar mitzvah. My youngest son Benjamin's looking around the office. He's looking around. He says to the rabbi, "Is this your office?" And the rabbi says, "Yes, this is my office, my study where I work." So Benjamin says, "So where's your laboratory?" Of course, at that time he thought everybody had a laboratory, because when they were young, I would bring them into the lab on the weekends, and they would pack pipette tip boxes, and I would give them $1/4 a box. So we had this little job that we would keep them occupied with, so that I could do what I needed to do whilst they were busy and earning a few dollars at the.
Well, I don't want to dwell on the organizations you're a member of. You are a member of many organizations, and your writings and your number of pieces of literature is astounding. I'd like you to, if you could, for the next couples, give me a brief narrative of the institute that you are the director, and tell us sort of the money you're responsible for, the kind of research, and how that happens. And then later I'd like to talk about the practice-based research issues that you're starting right now. But tell me about the NIDCR right now as a...
Well, the NIDCR is really the people at NIDCR. One of the most wonderful things about this position is you get to interact and work with such an incredibly dedicated group of folks. My deputy, Dushanka Kleinman, who I know you know well, is just this amazing individual, 24/7 at all times, and really has set the tone. She's been the anchor of the Institute through many directors now. Directors come and go, but Dushanka's, fortunately always there. And there are other people like Dushanka, just very many of them. And it's their creative energy that allow the Institute to break new ground and to be supportive of really leading edge biomedical research as it relates to oral and dental and craniofacial health. And so the Institute now has a budget of just over $392 million a year, which is, of course, just a wonderful resource set. And we're very grateful to the Congress who appropriate that resource set to us. And about 85% of that goes to the extramural community. And so last year, for the first time, we had over $300 million in the extramural community, which is really a great thing. The Institute, as I know you know, supports a very broad breadth of scientific areas. Restoration of function and form, of course, remains very important, but in contrast to many years ago where the emphasis was on metallurgy and ceramics, now, although we continue to support research in material science, it's more about nanotechnology and how it drives the next generation of composite restoration. But also, we now use biological approaches to this restoration of function and form, using smart scaffolds which inform stem cells to recapitulate missing hard and soft tissues. So this is a very, very exciting time in restorative research. We have a very active program in oral cancer. Of course, our emphasis is on early detection, early diagnosis, but also we are working through the molecular events that lead from the earliest incipient lesion to a full-blown oral cancer. We have a very active program, of course, in infectious diseases, caries and periodontal disease, as you might imagine, the advances in microbial genetics and genomics have now offered us a whole new set of potential targets where we can now consider plaque control or biofilm control, not only in terms of mechanical intervention, brushing and floss and so forth, but also chemically and biologically by disrupting the biofilm using small molecules. Of course, we go well beyond the simple intervention. When you have advanced disease, of course, we have to come up with new strategies to repair and redress that. The Institute has a very significant position in salivary diagnostics. This is really something that I wish I could take credit for, but actually my predecessor began the earliest phases of this opportunity, and I've been privileged to see it through now. So what we've done with this initiative is we've married bioengineers with oral biologists. What the bioengineers are able to do is they're able to create very tiny laboratories on a chip, so small that one can envision that someday they can actually be put in the mouth. These labs on a chip can measure multiple analytes simultaneously. We have chips now the size of a US dime that can measure over 100 analytes at one time. So you can envision a time when you could have one of these labs on a chip in your mouth and in real time interrogate multiple analytes, biomarkers of disease, and ultimately, we hope, biomarkers of health. And so what it allows you to do is to shift from the current paradigm that we employ, which is that of disease detection, to one of health surveillance. And we think that dentists and oral health professionals can really play a leading role in this sort of paradigm shift. And this is one that we're very pleased with as it moves closer and closer to fruition. It does allow for a number of auxiliary opportunities. So if we can do salivary diagnostics, what it may help do is it may help drive down the cost, not only of routine laboratory testing, but it also may drive down the cost of clinical trials. Because obviously any time you have to draw blood, that adds a tremendous cost to the trial. And so we think that hand in hand, this new initiative will have a rather important effect, both on how we look at disease and health in the future, but also how we're able to conduct clinical trials.
Well, I'm sure happy there are people like you that even can say those words, because it's getting into a phase where we need the clinical people talking, but we need the research people talking. And now that I bring that up, yesterday in the ADA News, I received a article that said the NIDCR awards $75 million for the dental research networks.
Right.
Now tell me about that, please, Larry.
Well, these are practice-based research networks that will allow us to conduct research in the community, in practitioners' offices all around the country. And these types of research networks have tremendous advantages in that they allow you to conduct research in a real-world setting. And as you certainly appreciate, we desperately need additional evidence for the many, many things that we do as a profession. And the reason that we have lacked this evidence is that so much of it is just practical in nature, and it's not the sort of research that lends itself to the academic health center. It just wouldn't make sense to do it in the academic health center. And so really taking a cue from our colleagues in medicine who have employed practice-based research networks for many years, the NIDCR launched this new initiative. Bruce Pelstrom is the person who's been heading this up for us. And this will allow us to compare different treatment modalities in real-world settings. It will allow us to determine the efficacy of certain restorative approaches to clinical situations faced by dentists daily. It will allow us to ascertain what the prevalence of certain rare diseases are within the guidelines of HIPAA. And so really this is an opportunity to link 100 or so practices around the country initially in a way that will allow them to conduct a number of short-term, but we hope very informative clinical research studies over the next 7 years. Now, this will take time to develop, but the Institute has, as you mentioned, has made a major commitment monetarily, also in terms of staff time, to work together with the leaders of the practice-based research networks. And what will be very special about this is that the practitioner researchers will have a very strong say in the types of questions that are going to be posed through the networks. So this will be a bottom-up kind of opportunity, and we really look forward to working together with the practitioners and the coordinators and the network leaders, because it really, I think, will ultimately open up more questions than not, and will begin to help strengthen the evidence base for the profession. So we're very, very excited about this.
And as a guy that worked at the chair for a long time, it'd be exciting to be one of those people that are assisting in the basic research. Yeah. As you pull it all together, it's got to have great benefits to our profession.
We certainly hope so, and actually the feedback that we have gotten from clinicians has been very, very positive, starting with where do I sign up, and so it's really quite exciting.
Now, as the director of the NIDCR, where do you see dental research direction? I mean, you now are the person that can change that. You're the person that can initiate creative things. Your background is certainly perfect for doing this stuff. Do you have any thoughts on where you're going with it?
Well, in fact, much of what we've tried to do over the past 5 years, and we'll have to continue to do as we move forward, is to get the community to engage in more clinical research.
Okay.
So the luxury of being a basic scientist, I'm allowed to say that we need more clinical research, because no one would accuse me of feathering my own nest, so to speak. But I'm absolutely convinced that we have a very special moment in time. With the completion of the human genome, as the so-called blueprint of life, with the completion of so many bacterial genomes of all the major potential pathogens of oral infectious disease, with advances in the way we can do clinical research, I think it's the absolute perfect moment in time to exploit the basic science and begin to accelerate the translation of that basic science into things that are more tangible, which will allow practitioners around the country to continue to deliver an even greater service and therapeutic advantage to their patients. So we're very high on clinical research. We really think that that's the true direction of where the Institute needs to invest even more in. The practice-based research networks is one leg of that, but then there's also the sort of gold standard of clinical research, the so-called phase 3 clinical trials, And I think what we will see from those are practice-changing findings. Let me give you a quick example. Epidemiologists for a number of years were showing that periodontal disease was somehow related with adverse pregnancy outcomes, for example, low birth weight or premature birth. But that really it can't provide you with a causal linkage. It can just tell you that there's some association and you don't know if it's causal or not. We launched several years ago phase 3 interventional trial, multi-center trials around the country to ask the question, if periodontal disease is treated during pregnancy, will the number of low birth weight babies decrease? And we don't have the answer yet, but if the answer comes out yes, think of what a tremendous contribution that would make, because as you know, a low birth weight baby is much more susceptible to just a horrendous list of medical conditions. And I think this is the direction that we need to continue to go. With these phase 3 trials, what we're doing in essence is we're reconnecting this back to the rest of the body. Both of my predecessors, Harold Low and Hal Slavkin, always emphasized the oral systemic interrelationships, and we're now at a point in time, because of the maturation of the science, where we can really begin to nail down some of these linkages. So I really think that that's the direction that the Institute must continue on. And again, one that we're very excited about, and one that the community is very excited about. So as I travel around the country speaking at schools of dentistry, the clinicians who are teaching our next generation of dentists to be practitioners of the future, they're excited about this. And the basic scientists are excited about this because they realize that one important clinical trial that changes the practice of dentistry and medicine will provide more basic research questions that they'll ever be able to answer in their lifetime. So really it's a push-pull, and it's really not one at the expense of the other necessarily. And so I think that that's really what we need to continue.
And a great part of that is the salary situation where you can do diagnostics.
Oh, indeed, it feeds in.
It's a major issue in that area.
Exactly.
Now, I know that stem cells seems to be always a big topic these days, both politically and academically. Where do you see dentistry in that particular area? Is a part that we could play or what we could learn? I'm sure that there is, because it has impact on everything else.
Oh, no doubt. Dentistry is and should be in the middle of this very important emerging field. As I mentioned earlier, restoration of form and function is so very important to what we do as a profession. And in the future, stem cells are going to be a way to restore hard and soft tissues of the orofacial complex. Now, as I'm sure you have learned, it turns out that deciduous teeth are a very fine source of postnatal stem cells. And so one could envision in the future a battle with the tooth fairy, where instead of giving the tooth to the tooth fairy, you give it to the stem cell bank for use in later life. Kidding aside, it turns out that these stem cells are able to form, under the proper conditions, bone as well as dentin. Really? And so one could see in the immediate horizon opportunities to do, for example, endodontic treatment or pulp capping in a much more biological way. And I would say that in terms of bone regeneration, there's also been a tremendous amount of progress in that area. And what I'm referring to are the large defects that heretofore have been more or less untreatable. So there's no question that stem cells will, are playing and will continue to play a very major role. Now, as you fast forward into the future, what eventually we'll be able to do with stem cells is we'll be able to create whole organs. So the biologically engineered tooth is something that we're just beginning to lay in the plans for, the blueprint for, if you will. And we recognize that this will take a very long period of time, but we know that there's going to be a tremendous amount learned along the way. Another project that we are just now beginning to discuss is the creation of an artificial salivary gland. So as you know, there are many people worldwide who suffer from oral dryness. Typically this is because of radiation for head and neck cancer, which impacts negatively on the salivary glands, or the autoimmune disease, Sjogren's disease, which affects several million people in this country. We think that the timing is right to begin to engineer an artificial salivary gland that could be implanted in people so afflicted. And so it will be a combination of stem cell biology and chemistry to create scaffolds, substratum, that will inform, that will in effect talk to the stem cells and say to them, create this sort of material in this sort of dimension, so that we can recapitulate the three-dimensional form and ultimately function of a salivary gland. And so I think stem cells are going to play a major role in the profession in the years to come. And interestingly enough, I think many of the young people, the dental students that I speak to around the country, are anxious to embrace this as part of their armamentarium.
Well, I wanted to ask you that question. If my grandson, who's getting old enough to go to college now, knocked on your door and said, "Doctor, should I go into dentistry? Is the future looking good?" Or my grandpa's one, but he's retired. What would you say to him?
I would tell your grandson that it is absolutely the best time to go into dentistry. Dentistry is this extraordinary profession that allows people so many different possibilities, and I think that's what makes for a good life is having so many possibilities. One can gain a satisfaction of practicing dentistry and delivering great care to one's patients. One can combine that with being an educator, imparting that knowledge to the next generation, and of course, if one is so inclined, you can even become a researcher. There are those rare individuals who are able to do all of that simultaneously, and that's wonderful. But even if you're only able to do sort of one thing at a time well, as certainly has underscored my career, there is still a contribution to be made. And given the juxtaposition of the amazing research advances in human genome biology and in engineering and in stem cell biology and in new ways of doing clinical trials, it is the absolute best time for people to go in oral health research.
Well, that's good from a grandson. Now, Larry, what's your immediate future? I mean, you've got things. You're a young guy. You're a smart guy. You certainly articulate. I'm totally impressed with. You can take Harold's place because you can articulate like him. What do you got in your immediate future? Anything different?
No. When I joined the NIH, I told everybody that I viewed it as a marathon, not a sprint. And with the support of my wife in particular and my family, we plan to remain in this position, assuming the director of NIH agrees, for a 10-year period. I'm just about finishing up my first 5 years of that 10-year term, and assuming the director of NIH wants me around, I'll be very honored to sign up for a second 5-year term. I think beyond that, it's a little premature to say. My whole career, I've always felt that you do something for about 10 years, and then you stand aside and you let somebody else do it.
I agree.
And I think that, particularly with the nature of this position, because it does have such a significant impact on the field's direction and so forth, I'm not certain it would be healthy for the field to have a person stay much longer than 10 years or so. Now, when I'm in year 9, I may feel differently about it because goodness knows of all the positions in the world, this one probably is the very, very best for somebody with my background. But of course it's not about me. It is about the field. And so I've always felt that 10 years is about right. What happens in year 11, I really have no idea.
Well, you apparently have the background, you have the family, you have the staff, you have it all together. And we do appreciate the time you sent here today to be with us, realizing that the government is somewhat demanding, and realizing that you have people around the world that are looking to you for guidance and looking to you for helping the profession of dentistry. And even though you didn't get to be a periodontist, and I'm a general dentist, so it's okay, you're an endodontist, but even more importantly than that is that you're helping our profession treat the body as a package, and the oral part of it is just one part of that. And thank you for fighting your traffic downtown here, Larry, and thank you for all the things you're doing, and we wish you the best and good health to keep it up, because we need a person like you leading us through this time in our professional careers.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.